The Imperium of Man stretches across 1,000,000 worlds, yet within each of those countless spheres of human habitation lies the same unyielding truth. Survival is not a birthright, but a sentence handed down by fear. It is fear of the alien that lurks at the edges of the void, fear of the heretic that festers in the heart of the hive, and fear of the demon whispering from beyond the veil. But above all, it is the fear of those who watch from the shadows, whose gaze weighs heavier than any planetary governor's decree or any space marine's oath. These are the Inquisitors, nameless, faceless arbiters whose presence cannot be escaped, only endured. The Imperium's subjects do not know their names, few ever glimpse their faces, yet across the ages whispers of their deeds ripple like poison in the bloodstream of mankind. A single Inquisitor may arrive on a world as an unremarkable wanderer, cloaked in dust and anonymity, only to depart leaving cities burning, records erased, and entire bloodlines extinguished. To the common citizen, their power seems mythic, omnipotent, almost divine, and perhaps it must be so, for the Imperium is a crumbling edifice. Without such watchers in the dark, the whole colossal structure would collapse under the weight of its own corruption. It was no accident that this order was born not in glory, but in ruin. In the wake of the Horus heresy, when the Emperor was enthroned in deathless agony and the galaxy reeled in confusion, Malcador the Sigillite and his chosen agents foresaw what none dared admit. The gravest danger to the Imperium would not come from enemies without, but from within. No fortress wall could be built high enough to repel betrayal, no legion vast enough to restrain ambition. If humanity was to endure, there must be a hand that could act unseen, unbound, unmerciful. Thus, the seed of the Inquisition was sown, a weapon forged not of armies, but of silence, secrecy, and absolute authority. From the beginning, their mandate was paradox incarnate, to save humanity by suspecting all of humanity. Inquisitors were entrusted with powers that dwarfed kings and cardinals, chapter masters and even high lords. They could command the release of holy relics, demand obedience from entire regiments of the Astra Militarum, or strip the governance from a sector without trial or appeal. The weight of a single rosette could reorder destinies and annihilate histories, yet for all their power, they stood perpetually at the brink, for a misjudgment could extinguish a loyal world as easily as it could prevent rebellion. To hold such authority was not to enjoy comfort, but to carry a burden as terrible as the galaxy itself. And so they became more than overseers. They became the silent conscience of the Imperium, a conscience that whispered not of mercy, but of vigilance, suspicion, and ruthless resolve. Each Inquisitor, regardless of ordo or creed, is trained to see not what is shown but what is hidden. The flicker of corruption in a priest's sermon, the tremor of fear in a governor's decree, the subtle mutations that speak of a cult festering beneath the hab-blocks of a hive city. To miss such signs is to invite damnation, for a single unheeded heretic can ignite a rebellion, and one unexamined relic can doom a sector to the touch of the warp. Yet this vigilance, this ceaseless probing into every shadow comes with a cost. For in the Imperium of Man, to suspect is to condemn, and to condemn is often to destroy. Countless worlds bear the scars of inquisitorial purges, planets where a few hidden cultists brought about the death of millions, all in the name of protection. The Inquisition has saved humanity 1,000 times, yet in saving it, they have scarred it beyond recognition. They are both surgeons and executioners, cutting away the sickness, even if it means killing the patient. Still, their existence is tolerated, even revered in fearful silence, because the alternative is unthinkable. Without Inquisitors, the Imperium would fall not to great armies, but to rot from within. And so their authority remains unquestioned, their secrecy unbroken, their methods unchallenged. But in granting such power, the Imperium has bound itself to a paradox it cannot escape. What happens when the hand that defends humanity grows too accustomed to destruction? When suspicion becomes not a tool but a creed? The question lingers in every whispered tale of the Inquisition, in every burned city and vanished record. It is a question no citizen dares ask aloud, for to question the Inquisition is to invite its gaze. And when the gaze of the Inquisition falls upon you, there is only silence, only judgment, only fire. And yet, as their power spread and their shadow lengthened, the Inquisition itself would fracture, forming into orders whose focus and methods would shape the destiny of the Imperium for millennia. For the threats to mankind are many, and in their ruthless vigilance, the Inquisitors divided their gaze: heresy, Xenos, demon. Thus began the rise of the Ordos Majoris. The Horus heresy had ended, but victory was a corpse's triumph. The Emperor of mankind, once radiant and unassailable, had been carried broken and bleeding to the Golden Throne, condemned to an eternity of silent agony. Terra itself lay in ruins, its soil blackened, its skies choked with ash, its people stripped of certainty. The loyal legions were shattered, half their brothers turned traitor, and faith in unity was buried beneath the rubble of the imperial palace. The Imperium that remained was not a fortress of strength, but a wounded giant staggering forward out of sheer necessity. It was into this twilight of trust that Malcador the Sigillite moved, with eyes sharpened not by hope, but by necessity. Malcador had foreseen that betrayal was not an anomaly, but a certainty. If War Masters could fall, if Primarchs could kneel to the Dark Gods, then who within the Imperium could ever be, free of suspicion? To bind mankind together, he reasoned, would require more than faith, more than the promise of the Emperor's light. It would require fear, an unrelenting watch that would scour every shadow for heresy, every heart for treachery. And so he entrusted to his most secret disciples a mandate unlike any other, to protect the Imperium not from its enemies in the stars, but from the poison growing within its veins. The origins of the Inquisition were spoken only in whispers, recorded in fragments, encoded in archives so secret that even High Lords centuries later would debate their authenticity. The first agents were not bureaucrats or governors, but warriors and thinkers, chosen for their unswerving loyalty to the throne and their willingness to bear a burden no other could. They were not numerous, for secrecy demanded scarcity. Malcador knew that to give such power to legions would be to invite disaster. A single inquisitor could move unseen, but a host would draw fear and rebellion. Thus the Inquisition began as a handful of individuals armed with authority greater than entire worlds. Their symbol was simple yet terrible, the inquisitorial seal, wrought as a great eye bound in red, flanked with skulls and sigils of purity. It was not forged for ceremony but for judgment, the sign that no law, no rank, no bloodline stood above their scrutiny. A single inquisitor bearing this mark could walk unchallenged into the halls of planetary lords or the cloisters of the ecclesiarchy, their words heavier than armies, their silence heavier still. The seal became more than a mark of office. It was a shadow cast across every level of imperial life, a reminder that even loyalty was suspect if unexamined. Yet this was no unified council with codified laws. From the first, inquisitors acted alone, each carrying out the mandate as their conscience, or suspicion, dictated. Some pursued the remnants of traitor legions, hunting the word-bearers across the warp-touch fringes. Others rooted out cults festering in the lower hives of terror itself, executing thousands to prevent the spread of whispers that chaos still lingered. Each inquisitor acted independently, for unity would have exposed them, and consensus would have slowed them. Their strength lay not in armies, but in their ability to vanish into rumour, to strike without warning, and to vanish again before the galaxy could measure their impact. But secrecy was a double-edged weapon. Even as they pursued heresy, questions arose among imperial officials. Who held these inquisitors accountable? By whose authority could a single agent order the death of a world or the silencing of an entire fleet? The paradox was plain even then. The Inquisition was both the guardian and the threat, the protector and the predator. And yet Malcador's gamble was proven wise in blood. Without their intervention, the Imperium's wounds after the heresy would have festered until rot consumed all. It was in this crucible that the first divisions of thought emerged. Some inquisitors believed their task was simple, to destroy heresy wherever it was found, no matter the cost. Others whispered that survival demanded more subtlety, that enemies could sometimes be bent to serve against one another. These seeds of divergence, small at first, would one day grow into vast ideological chasms, radical and Puritan, monodominant and xanthite. But in those early years the only certainty was necessity. From these beginnings came the first shape of the Ordos Majoris. Though not yet formalized, inquisitors found themselves drawn to different fronts of battle. Those who dedicated themselves to stamping out the lingering embers of traitor cults became the foundation of the Ordo Hereticus. Those who pursued demons and warp-born corruption became the progenitors of the Ordo Malleus. Those who tracked alien influences that threatened a wounded Imperium laid the roots of the Ordo Xenos. These were not yet names but tendencies, the first shadow of divisions that would one day harden into doctrine. The irony was already woven into their creation. Born to preserve the Imperium in an age of distrust, the Inquisition itself would become a body distrusted even by those it defended. It was granted absolute power in an empire where absolute power had already wrought betrayal. And as centuries passed, the memory of Malcador's careful hand would fade, replaced by the image of inquisitors as omnipotent lords whose seal could decide the fate of millions. Even so, in the earliest years, their existence was a secret hope, a desperate safeguard against annihilation. The galaxy was scarred, the Emperor silent, and humanity stood alone against endless threats. The Inquisition was the blade hidden within the folds of the Imperium's robes, unsheathed only when survival demanded it. But a weapon unsheathed too often ceases to be a safeguard. It becomes a habit, a creed, a shadow that grows until it covers everything. And so, as the first centuries of their existence passed, the Inquisition began to take shape not merely as guardians, but as rulers in all but name. Their orders would grow sharper, their mandates clearer, their powers more terrible. What began as a small circle of silent watchers would become the most feared authority in the galaxy, not through numbers, but through the absolute absence of restraint. The path to that ascendancy would be paved in fire during an age when corruption from within the Imperium itself nearly consumed it whole. That age would be remembered as the apostasy, and it would be the crucible in which the Inquisition proved its dominion. The centuries that followed the heresy were not years of healing but of simmering unrest, a slow fever burning through the Imperium's veins. The Emperor's silence had left a vacuum, and in that void power accumulated in strange, unstable ways. The High Lords of Terror, the Ecclesiarchy, and the Adeptus Mechanicus jostled for influence, each claiming to act in the Emperor's name. It was in this shifting landscape that the Inquisition moved like smoke, shaping itself into something more defined, more enduring, and more terrible. What had begun as a handful of agents grew into strands of purpose, pulled inexorably toward different threats, and so, almost without design, the orders began to crystallize. Heresy, more than any external enemy, remained the rawest wound. The scars of the traitor legions and their cults festered in every hive, shrine, and fleet. Inquisitors who dedicated themselves to rooting out sedition, apostasy, and hidden cults became the backbone of what would be named the Ordo Hereticus. They stalked the halls of cardinals, silenced entire convents of priests suspected of harbouring doubts, and scoured the underhives where whispers of chaos spread like rot. Their presence grew so entwined with the Ecclesiarchy that fear of them became indistinguishable from fear of divine judgment. Others, however, recognized that the heresy had been more than mere betrayal of brothers. It had been the work of the warp, of demons whose whispers bent primarchs to their knees. For these inquisitors, the true enemy was not the heretic, but the shadow that had corrupted him. Thus arose the Ordo Malleus, their gaze fixed upon the immaterial. They hunted sorcerers, cults devoted to forbidden rituals, and the warp-spawned entities that bled into reality where the veil grew thin. Their most secret triumph was the forging of the Grey Knights, a chapter born not of gene seed alone, but of a singular mandate, to fight demons with incorruptible devotion. Bound to the Ordo Malleus, they became the chamber militant of a war that could never be acknowledged in daylight. Yet even as these two branches sharpened their gaze inward, others looked outward, to the alien empires pressing at humanity's borders. Orcs swarmed in unending tides, Eldar raiders struck with surgical cruelty, and darker, hungrier threats stirred in the void. For these inquisitors, no Xenos could be tolerated, no negotiation trusted, no coexistence permitted. They became the Ordo Xenos, the hidden blade that cut down alien influence before it could take root. Their methods were diverse. Disguised agents infiltrating mercantile guilds tainted by trade with Eldar corsairs, assassination of planetary governors who dallied with alien technologies, or silent purges of entire colonies suspected of Xenos corruption. They alone sanctioned the work of the Death Watch, space marines drawn from many chapters, united under a single oath, the annihilation of the alien wherever it was found. Though the names came later, the divisions were already present. Each ordo sharpened its focus with every passing century, yet all shared a single creed. No threat could be tolerated, no risk left unchecked. Their growing power, however, brought with it an irony. The more specialized they became, the less unified the Inquisition grew. An inquisitor who had devoted his life to eradicating heresy often saw little value in the obsessions of his peers who hunted demons or aliens. Rivalries flared, doctrines clashed, and accusations of negligence or corruption became as common as accusations levelled against the Imperium's enemies. This internal tension was not weakness but design. It was the paradox Malcador had set in motion. Inquisitors would guard not only the Imperium, but each other, ever suspicious, ever watchful, so that none could slip into complacency or fall unnoticed into damnation. But suspicion breeds suspicion, and as their authority spread, Inquisitors became as likely to turn their gaze upon one another as upon the Imperium's foes. By their nature, they were hunters who could never rest, and eventually the prey would be found in their own ranks. Still, to the wider Imperium, they appeared unstoppable. To governors and generals, Inquisitors were storms that descended without warning, demanding obedience, punishing hesitation, wielding the Emperor's authority like a blade. To the ecclesiarchy, they were both partners and jailers, feared as much as they were venerated. To the common citizen, they were myths, invoked in whispers to frighten children into obedience or to explain the sudden disappearance of entire families. The Inquisition's name became a weapon in itself, a word that needed no proof, no justification. It was inevitable, then, that in an Imperium already riddled with ambition and excess, their growing shadow would eventually collide with power structures too entrenched to yield quietly. When the ecclesiarchy swelled into decadence, when its cardinals and high lords corrupted faith into tyranny, it would be the Inquisition that moved against them, and in doing so, they would not simply guard the Imperium from heresy, they would reshape it in fire. That reckoning would come in the age of apostasy, when faith and power fused into nightmare, and the Inquisition would step fully from the shadows to burn away the rot at the heart of the Imperium. The tide of corruption within the ecclesiarchy did not rise suddenly, but like a slow flood, it seeped into every sanctuary and altar until faith itself became a currency of power. Inquisitors had long warned that unchecked devotion could curdle into tyranny, but in the centuries following the rise of the Ordos, their warnings were drowned beneath the pomp of cardinals and the gold of shrines. The ecclesiarchy swelled into a behemoth of opulence, draped in silks while hive cities starved, raising statues to themselves while the emperor's shrines decayed in shadow. It was an age when the worship of the god-emperor, once the fragile binding of a wounded Imperium, was twisted into a theatre of control, and in this theatre one name eclipsed all others, Gog Vandir. Vandir's ascent was not born of sanctity, but of ruthless ambition. As both ecclesiarch and high lord of the administratum, he wielded two thrones of power uniting temporal and spiritual authority in his own hands. To the faithful, he was a voice of divine certainty. To the ambitious, he was a storm to be weathered. But to the Inquisition, he was a cancer that could not be ignored. Vandir's reign of blood transformed the Imperium into a realm where dissent was slaughtered and loyalty was purchased with terror. The cathedrals of terror rang with hymns not of devotion, but of obedience to a man who claimed the Emperor's will as his own. It was here, in the age of apostasy, that the Inquisition was forced to show its full hand. Silent warnings no longer sufficed. The rot had reached too deeply. Inquisitors who once debated whether to intervene now acted with fury, purging cardinals, silencing rogue preachers, and dismantling sects that had fattened themselves on lies. Yet even the Inquisition found itself tested, for Vandir had secured protectors of his own, the brides of the Emperor, warrior maidens who believed themselves chosen to defend his throne. Their blades clashed with the Inquisition's authority, and for a time it seemed even inquisitorial seals might shatter against the certainty of their faith. It was Sebastian Thor who became the fulcrum of this storm. A preacher who spoke not of Vandir's decrees but of the Emperor's truth. Thor's words carried across sectors like fire through dry fields. His defiance was not backed by armies or fleets, but by the weight of faith uncorrupted and Inquisitors saw in him not a rival but a weapon. Inquisitorial agents moved to protect him, to amplify his message, to wield his conviction against the tyrant who claimed to be divine mouthpiece. And when Vandir fell, struck down not only by blades, but by the inevitable collapse of lies, the Inquisition stood as both architect and witness of the purge. In the ashes that followed, the ecclesiarchy was remade, its power broken, its excess curbed by decree that no men might again command armies in the name of faith. Yet here the Inquisition revealed its most cunning paradox. In dismantling Vandir's reign, they forged a new bond with the very force they had humbled. For it was in those fires that the brides of the Emperor were reborn as the Adeptus Sororitas, no longer servants of a tyrant, but the chamber militant of the Ordo Hereticus. What had begun as opposition became alliance, a marriage of suspicion and devotion bound in the promise of vigilance. From that crucible, the Inquisition emerged no longer as shadows whispering at the edges of imperial power, but as arbiters who could unseat high lords, redirect entire faiths, and reorder the destiny of mankind. The age of apostasy proved that Inquisitors were not merely guardians against heresy. They were executioners of institutions, destroyers of false certainties, and architects of survival through fire. Yet the lesson lingered, bitter and unresolved. If Inquisitors could break the ecclesiarchy, what other pillars of the Imperium might one day fall beneath their scrutiny? And as the fires of apostasy cooled, the Inquisition itself began to harden into an institution of its own, its chambers more structured, its conclaves more deliberate, its doctrines more refined. With power consolidated and allies secured, the Inquisition turned its gaze inward, not only upon the Imperium but upon itself, forging the anatomy of secrecy and suspicion that would define it for millennia. In the silence after the apostasy, when the ecclesiarchy had been humbled and the shrines rebuilt with new vows of purity, the Inquisition itself began to look inward. For though it had acted as saviour, its methods had revealed to all the Imperium what had always been true, that Inquisitors were not wanderers in shadows alone, but rulers cloaked in secrecy, arbiters who could alter the course of mankind with a single word. To wield such power without fracturing under its weight required more than instinct and loyalty. It required structure, doctrine, and tools worthy of an empire of 1,000,000 worlds. Thus the anatomy of the Inquisition took form, not as a monolithic order, but as a web of cells, conclaves, and hierarchies designed to endure through suspicion itself. At the heart of their authority lay the rosette, a simple sigil, heavy with meaning, carved into metal or inscribed with sacred circuitry. To the unknowing eye it was a symbol, to the Imperium it was the Emperor's voice given form. A bearer of the rosette could overrule governors, command regiments, silence cardinals, and invoke exterminatus upon a world, and no authority short of the High Lords could gainsay them. The rosette was not a badge of honour, but a sentence of responsibility, and Inquisitors carried it with the understanding that its weight might one day demand the death of billions. Yet Inquisitors did not act alone. Beneath them spread networks of acolytes, retainers, and agents whose loyalty was tested not by oath alone, but by the crucible of secrecy. These acolytes were investigators, assassins, interrogators, and scribes, chosen as much for their expendability as for their skill. Few survived long enough to ascend, and fewer still were trusted with the secrets their masters carried. Entire lives were consumed in the service of investigations whose scope might never be explained to them, and entire cells could be burned away at the faintest whiff of compromise. The Inquisition endured not through trust, but through layers of silence, each agent seeing only fragments of a whole too vast to comprehend. Above these scattered operatives, Inquisitors themselves gathered in conclaves, shadowy councils where matters of doctrine, resource, and policy were debated. These conclaves were not binding in law, for no Inquisitor acknowledged any master save the Emperor, but in practice they became crucibles where power was brokered and alliances forged. Disputes between radicals and Puritans, between Ordo Xenos and Ordo Malleus, were often aired in these chambers, though rarely resolved. Inquisitors, bound by suspicion even of their peers, understood that consensus was dangerous, for unity invited corruption. Better to argue endlessly, to divide and accuse, than to allow complacency to fester. Lords Inquisitor rose from among their number, figures of vast influence who acted as arbiters for sectors or regions of the Imperium. Their authority was neither hereditary nor permanent, but born of reputation, cunning, and the respect, or fear, of their peers. Some became near-legendary figures whose names alone carried the weight of command. Others vanished into obscurity when their influence waned. To be a Lord Inquisitor was not to ascend above suspicion, but to carry the heaviest burden of it. For every word spoken might shape the policy of an entire sector. The doctrines that guided them were no less fractured. Some Inquisitors clung to Puritan creeds, declaring that only absolute destruction of the alien, the mutant, and the heretic could preserve humanity. They invoked the monodominant philosophy, wherein mankind was the sole measure of worth, and all else was fuel for the pyre. Others embraced the dangerous lure of radicalism, believing that forbidden tools, demon hosts, Xenos artifacts, warp-born sorcery, might be turned against the enemies of mankind. Between these extremes lay countless shades: Amalathians seeking stability above all, Istvanians who provoked wars to strengthen the species, Xanthites who sought to master chaos itself. Each Inquisitor bore not only the weight of their office, but the constant peril that their creed might be judged heresy by their peers. To hold such power demanded tools of unparalleled terror. The Inquisition commanded hidden fortresses where prisoners were broken and secrets stripped from unwilling throats. They possessed labyrinthine archives of prescribed knowledge, guarded by servitors whose minds had been erased save for obedience. And when all else failed, they held the writ of exterminatus, the authority to burn a world to ash rather than allow corruption to spread. Virus bombs, cyclonic torpedoes, orbital firestorms, these were not weapons of war but of final judgment, instruments that declared an entire planet unfit for survival. It was a tool used rarely, for even Inquisitors understood that each exterminatus scarred the Imperium itself, but the knowledge that such power existed in their grasp was often enough to compel obedience from even the proudest lords. All of this, the Rosette, the Acolytes, the Conclaves, the doctrines, the fortresses, the writs of exterminatus, was not designed to build trust, but to weaponize suspicion. The Inquisition was never meant to be loved, never meant to inspire loyalty, but to instill fear deep enough that corruption would wither in its shadow. And yet, in this reliance on fear, the seeds of corruption were ever present. For what Inquisitor, granted such power, could forever resist the temptation to wield it beyond necessity? What line existed between vigilance and tyranny, between the defense of mankind and its slow strangulation? The paradox that had haunted them since their birth deepened with every passing century. The more structured and powerful they became, the more they risked becoming the very danger they were created to prevent. The galaxy would soon see the truth of this in ways no doctrine could disguise, for among the Inquisition itself divisions festered, and from those cracks would emerge a conflict far more insidious than alien empires or demonic incursions. It was the radical schism, when Inquisitors ceased merely to suspect their enemies and began to suspect each other. Suspicion had always been the marrow of the Inquisition, but in time suspicion turned inward, curling back upon those who carried the Rosette itself. For as their powers grew and their doctrines hardened, Inquisitors discovered that the greatest danger to the Imperium might not lie in cults festering in hive basements or demons clawing through rent skies, but in the choices made by their own kind. The paradox of their authority was unavoidable. If no one stood above them save the Emperor, then who could restrain them when their judgment drifted toward heresy? It was here that the radical schism was born, not in open rebellion, but in 1,000 private decisions where the line between necessity and corruption blurred into ash. The Puritans declared that survival depended on absolute rejection of the alien, the heretic, and the demon. To them, compromise was weakness, and weakness was death. But their peers, faced with threats that grew ever more insidious, began to question whether destruction alone could suffice. The galaxy was wide, the enemies infinite, the Imperium fragile. Could mankind truly endure if it refused every tool, no matter how dangerous? Radicals whispered that the warp zone weapons might be turned against it, that alien knowledge might be dissected and bound to human purpose, that conflict itself might be engineered to strengthen the species. They did not see heresy in such acts, but pragmatism, the grim arithmetic of survival. These whispers became creeds, The Istvanians argued that humanity thrived through conflict, that strife was the crucible which purged weakness and forged strength. Better to provoke war, they claimed, than to allow mankind to stagnate. The Xanthites ventured further still, proposing that the power of chaos could be harnessed without submission, its demons bound into servitude, its warp energies mastered by human will. To Puritans, such philosophies were blasphemy so blatant that they could not be tolerated. To radicals, they were the only means of confronting enemies whose numbers and powers dwarfed mankind's own. The schism was not a single war, but a ceaseless hidden conflict that stretched across centuries. Inquisitors denounced one another, hunted one another, even executed one another, each certain that they alone understood the Emperor's will. Radicals would vanish into the void, only to return decades later wielding knowledge or weapons that should not exist. Puritans would respond with purges that erased entire archives, destroyed whole convents, and silenced anyone who had so much as spoken with their rivals. These were not wars fought in banners and battle lines, but in assassinations, secret trials, and disappearances. Every victory left scars upon the Imperium, for each Inquisitor destroyed was one less guardian against the true enemies that pressed from beyond. And yet, the schism could never truly be resolved, for both sides drew their arguments from the same wound, the survival of mankind in a galaxy designed for its destruction. Puritans demanded purity at any cost, even if that cost was extinction. Radicals demanded survival by any means, even if those means led to damnation. Neither could yield, and so the Inquisition became an institution at war with itself, its unity a fiction, its purpose a battlefield. The Imperium, for all its vastness, began to feel the consequences. Entire wars were fought not against heretics or Xenos, but sparked by inquisitorial rivalries. A radical inquisitor experimenting with forbidden weapons might bring down the wrath of a Puritan conclave, and in the chaos of their struggle whole worlds would be caught and broken. To the citizens who suffered, there was no distinction between heretic and inquisitor. Both came cloaked in fire, both left ruin behind. The very organisation meant to safeguard humanity became, at times, indistinguishable from the threats it hunted. Still, the schism endured because it could not be otherwise. The Imperium's enemies evolved, adapted, multiplied, and in facing them, Inquisitors were forced to walk the knife's edge between vigilance and corruption. Each step demanded judgment, and every judgment carved another fissure into their unity. The suspicion that once bound them together became the very poison that set them apart. And in that poison lay the seeds of darker days to come. For when Inquisitors clashed with one another, when purges consumed their own ranks, when faith and pragmatism turned to mutual annihilation, the Imperium itself trembled. These divisions would not remain hidden forever. In time, they would spill outward, shaping not only inquisitorial fate, but the fate of worlds. Wars of faith and purges of entire planets awaited, where Inquisitors would wield their full authority not only against enemies of mankind, but against mankind itself. The schism within the Inquisition did not remain confined to conclaves or secret trials. Inevitably, the clash of doctrines spilled outward, dragging entire sectors into its wake. Where Puritans saw corruption, they brought fire. Where radicals pursued their dangerous experiments, the purges followed swiftly. And when Inquisitors disagreed on the fate of a world, it was rarely the world that survived the argument. Thus began the age of purges and wars of faith, when the Inquisition's authority no longer struck at shadows alone, but scarred the Imperium in ways that could not be hidden. Worlds whispered of Inquisitors descending without warning, their fleets blotting out suns, their demands leaving governors paralysed between obedience and ruin. A single seal raised in judgment could condemn billions. The cleansing of Gathalamor became legend, when whispers of demonic influence led to orbital bombardments that turned thriving cities into molten glass. On Van Horn's world, suspicion of alien corruption in the nobility ended not with investigation, but with cyclonic torpedoes, reducing palace and populace alike to radioactive dust. These were not isolated acts of fanaticism, but sanctioned decisions, etched into inquisitorial archives as examples of necessary sacrifice. The pattern became unmistakable. To save the Imperium, entire worlds could be, and often were, erased. Exterminatus was the most dreadful of their tools, and yet inquisitors invoked it with the calm of surgeons amputating a diseased limb. Virus bombs reduced continents to oceans of sludge in moments. Firestorms unleashed from orbit devoured the air itself, leaving nothing but charred stone. In some cases, the silence afterward was more devastating than the destruction, for not only were the guilty annihilated, but the innocent, the histories, the cultures, all were consumed in a single act of judgment. To the Inquisition, these were tragic necessities. To the survivors who watched their neighbouring worlds vanish into ash, it was indistinguishable from tyranny. Yet the purges were not merely acts of annihilation. They became wars of faith, campaigns waged against those who resisted inquisitorial decrees or dared to question their judgment. Planets whose leaders hesitated to hand over suspected heretics were branded traitors. Sectors where governors sought compromise were bled in wars of attrition until obedience was absolute. The Adeptus Sororitas marched as the chamber militant of the Order Hereticus, their hymns rising alongside the screams of those they burned. Deathwatch kill teams struck from the void at the command of the Ordo Xenos, slaughtering entire alien enclaves before a word of explanation could reach the Vox. Grey Knights descended in silence, their wars unrecorded, their victories spoken of only in the hushed tones of survivors who saw demons turn to dust and knew that something worse had been narrowly averted. These conflicts etched terror deep into the Imperium's psyche. No man, no woman, no world could claim safety when Inquisitors walked the stars. To obey was no guarantee of survival. To resist was to invite annihilation. Faith itself became weaponized, with Inquisitors using rival cults or preachers to fracture resistance from within. What began as suspicion became crusade, and what began as judgment became extermination. The people of the Imperium, already cowed by the threats of heresy and Xenos, now learned that salvation itself could descend with fire and end in ruin. But even as they burned and purged, Inquisitors rarely found resolution. Each world destroyed left questions unanswered. Was the heresy truly rooted out, or merely silenced? Did the annihilation of a people preserve the Imperium, or weaken it irreparably? The archives grew thick with examples where the truth was never certain, where the act of destruction became an end in itself. And beneath it all lingered the terrible irony. The Inquisition, created to preserve humanity, was shaping the Imperium into a realm where fear itself was the only constant. Yet this cycle of judgment and destruction could not remain contained forever. Every purge echoed across the Imperium, stirring new doubts, new conspiracies, and new fractures. Inquisitors who watched their peers annihilate worlds began to wonder whether the greatest threat of all was not the heretic or the alien, but the unchecked authority of the Inquisition itself. And as the galaxy staggered into ever greater crises, their suspicions would deepen, pulling them into webs of conspiracy where even trust itself became a weapon. The firestorms of the purges left more than ash in their wake. They left silence, and in that silence conspiracies thrived. The Imperium had always been a labyrinth of power, its institutions overlapping, contradicting, and devouring one another. But within the Inquisition, suspicion turned from tool to obsession, until Inquisitors ceased to see the galaxy as divided between loyal and heretic, and instead as divided between rival visions of what humanity's survival truly meant. Wars of faith might erase worlds, but wars of ideology would hollow out the Inquisition itself. Cults and cabals began to form, not among the faithful masses, but among Inquisitors themselves. Thorianis whispered of the Emperor's resurrection, claiming his divine essence might be sought and rekindled in a mortal vessel. Amalathians, horrified by centuries of bloodshed, argued that the Imperium must be preserved exactly as it was, stagnant but unbroken, for change was the greatest danger of all. Recongregators urged the opposite, claiming the Imperium's institutions were rotten beyond salvation, and must be torn down so that mankind might be rebuilt from purer foundations. Each faction saw itself as loyal, each swore it alone understood the Emperor's true will, and yet their rivalries turned the Inquisition into a battlefield where loyalty was measured not by faith in the throne, but by allegiance to doctrine. The methods of these cabals were as shadowed as their goals. Thorianis funded secret experiments, some bordering on heresy, seeking to bind divine essence to flesh. Amalathians manipulated conclaves, placing governors and cardinals who would maintain their vision of stability, no matter how decayed. Recongregators struck with calculated ruthlessness, toppling dynasties, disbanding militias, collapsing whole cult structures not out of suspicion, but out of design, ensuring that no flawed institution could linger long enough to spread weakness. Even within the Inquisition, secrecy bred suspicion, and suspicion bred blood. Inquisitors turned their interrogators upon their peers, agents spied not on heretics, but on other inquisitorial cells, and assassinations claimed those whose doctrines threatened the balance of power. To the Imperium at large, these conflicts were invisible, for they played out in shadows, disguised as routine purges or unexplained disappearances. Yet the consequences rippled outward. A governor deposed by an Amalathian inquisitor left a world vulnerable to cult uprisings. A Thorianist experiment unleashed warp entities that demanded Puritan intervention. A recongregator purge destabilized entire sectors, drawing alien predators to feed on the collapse. What seemed to citizens as chaos or misfortune was, in truth, often the clash of inquisitors who warred not against heresy alone, but against each other's vision of survival. The deeper the conspiracies grew, the more indistinguishable truth became from manipulation. Inquisitors who uncovered heresy had to ask whether it was planted by their rivals. Those who received aid wondered whether it was genuine or a leash. The labyrinth thickened and the refrain echoed. In an empire where suspicion is law, even loyalty becomes suspect. And still, beyond the veil of their infighting, the galaxy burned. The Tyranids advanced from the void. The Eldar struck in raids of eerie precision. The Orcs gathered in ever greater wars. Chaos whispered through every scar left by the heresy. The Imperium staggered beneath enemies unending, while the very institution charged with its protection consumed itself in hidden wars. This corrosion could not remain hidden forever. When the storm of Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade broke upon the Imperium, Inquisitors were forced into the open, their divisions revealed, their schisms weaponized against them, for in that moment of desperate crisis, the question could no longer be ignored. Would the Inquisition stand as one to save the Imperium, or tear itself apart while the galaxy drowned in fire? The storm that had long gathered on the edges of the Imperium finally broke, and when it did, the divisions within the Inquisition were laid bare for all to see. Abaddon the Despoiler unleashed his 13th Black Crusade upon the galaxy, a tide of corruption and steel that surged from the Eye of Terror into the heart of Imperial space. It was a moment when unity was demanded, when every organ of the Imperium was called to stand as one or fall together. But within the Inquisition, unity was the very thing they could not summon. Their rivalries, once hidden in conclaves and buried in coded archives, erupted into action upon the battlefield itself. For Puritan Inquisitors, the Crusade was proof of every warning they had ever uttered. Chaos could never be bargained with, never tamed, never wielded. Their answer was fire, and they invoked it with merciless conviction. Entire sectors deemed compromised were subjected to exterminatus, not because they had fallen, but because they might fall. In their calculus, it was better to sacrifice billions of lives than risk the corruption of billions more. Their fleets darkened the skies of worlds already besieged, raining fire on cities still fighting in the Emperor's name. To them, this was loyalty beyond compromise. To others, it was madness cloaked as devotion. Radicals saw opportunity where Puritans saw only damnation. Some unleashed demon hosts bound horrors of the warp pressed into chains of ritual, sending them against the Despoiler's forces with catastrophic effect. Others sought pacts with alien powers, bartering fragile truces to stall the tide of chaos. In their desperation, they crossed lines once thought inviolate, and in doing so confirmed the Puritans' worst fears. Reports spread of Inquisitors wielding forbidden Xenos weapons, of chaos cults suddenly turning on their masters under the control of radical handlers, of demon blades flashing alongside bolter fire in the defense of imperial worlds. To the soldiers who fought and bled in those campaigns, the difference between heresy and salvation blurred into indistinguishable terror. Inquisitors clashed not only with the foe, but with one another. In the chaos of war zones, conclaves fractured into violence, Puritans turning their guns not only on traitors but on radicals they deemed no different. Radicals retaliated in kind, their followers assassinating rivals even as battle still raged around them. Fleets diverted fire from Chaos vessels to annihilate inquisitorial ships carrying opposing doctrines. On Cadia itself, where the fate of the Imperium teetered on the edge, Inquisitors who should have stood as one instead pulled in opposite directions, their conflicting orders sowing chaos among commanders who no longer knew which authority to obey. The tragedy was not that Inquisitors disagreed, but that their disagreements were carved into the galaxy with fire and blood. For every radical victory that bent forbidden tools to Imperial survival, a Puritan purge followed that erased the gains along with those who fought for them. For every Puritan cleansing that eradicated chaos corruption, radicals saw only squandered lives and sought to replace loss with yet darker bargains. The Black Crusade became not only a war between the Imperium and Chaos, but a proving ground for the Inquisition's schism, and in that proving ground the Imperium bled more deeply than even the despoiler intended. When Cadia finally fell, torn apart by the forces it had resisted for millennia, the failure was not solely Abaddon's triumph. It was the consequence of an Imperium unable to reconcile itself, and of an Inquisition so divided that its power became as much curse as weapon. The galaxy staggered into the time of ending, and in that twilight the Inquisition remained, its authority unbroken, its divisions unresolved, its hand still raised to judge, to burn, to silence. The Black Crusade had proven only what had always been true, that the Inquisition was both shield and blade, saviour and executioner, protector and destroyer. And yet, as the Imperium reeled in the wake of Cadia's death, a darker realization spread. If the Inquisition could not unify in the face of the greatest threat of the age, what hope remained that it could ever unify at all? The answer lay not in their battles, but in their legacy, the scars they left upon humanity, the institutions they reshaped, and the terrible weight of their omnipotence. It was in the aftermath that the true consequences of their authority would be revealed, consequences that no crusade, no war, no purge could ever undo. The death of Cadia did not silence the Inquisition. It amplified its presence. In the void left by shattered bastions and broken faith, Inquisitors pressed their authority with greater urgency than ever, determined to prove that the Imperium's survival still depended upon their vigilance. Yet the Black Crusade had laid bare what none could now deny. The Inquisition was not a monolith, but a paradox, an authority both indispensable and corrosive. To the Imperium at large it was shield and blade in equal measure, salvation through fire, protection through annihilation. To live under its watch was to accept that safety might arrive clad in firestorms, and that survival itself might demand the erasure of everything one loved. Inquisitors themselves could not escape this duality. For every world they purged, questions lingered. Had they truly destroyed a cancer, or had they amputated a limb that might have healed? For every radical who wielded forbidden knowledge, whispers spread of compromise too deep to conceal. Even Puritans, vaunted for their purity, could not avoid the shadow of tyranny, their zeal devouring the very humanity they claimed to defend. And yet, without them, the Imperium would have long since dissolved into chaos. It was the cruel irony of the Inquisition. The more it acted, the more it weakened the Imperium even as it preserved it. Among the common people, the Inquisition was legend made flesh. Most citizens would never see one of its agents, yet their lives bent beneath its unseen weight. A whispered accusation could erase a family. A seal upon parchment could empty a city. To speak of Inquisitors was to invoke both terror and awe, for they were at once the hand of the Emperor and the shadow of judgment. Entire generations grew believing that Inquisitors walked unseen among them, listening, watching, ready to burn at the faintest whiff of heresy. This belief was not discouraged, for fear itself was a tool sharper than any blade. And still, the Inquisition endured because the galaxy demanded it. Xenos empires did not relent, demonic incursions did not falter, and human corruption did not sleep. The High Lords tolerated the Inquisition's unchecked authority not because they trusted it, but because they knew the Imperium could not survive without it. To dismantle the Inquisition would be to strip the Imperium of its immune system, fragile though it was, and expose mankind to collapse. Yet to preserve it was to allow the infection of suspicion and tyranny to spread ever deeper into the body politic. It was a prison with no door, a choice with no escape. For Inquisitors, The burden was personal as much as political. They lived lives of ceaseless paranoia, unable to trust their peers, their acolytes, sometimes even themselves. Every victory brought new doubts, every compromise carried the seed of corruption, every decision demanded sacrifices too vast to be forgotten. Many descended into obsession, others into despair, some into a cold detachment where human lives became mere numbers in a ledger of survival. And when their time ended, whether by death in the field or assassination at the hands of their rivals, they left little behind but records locked in vaults and scars carved into history. The Black Crusade had shown the Imperium that even at its most desperate, the Inquisition could not stand as one. But perhaps unity had never been its purpose. Perhaps suspicion itself was the Emperor's design, that the constant scrutiny, the endless fear, the refusal to allow trust, was the only way to keep the Imperium from collapsing into complacency. If so, then the Inquisition was not merely an institution, but a philosophy, a truth etched into the marrow of mankind. Survival requires vigilance, and vigilance devours mercy. The consequences of this truth ripple endlessly. For every world saved, another is scarred. For every heresy stamped out, another festers in secrecy. For every inquisitor raised to power, another falls to suspicion. The Imperium survives, but it survives as something twisted, bound together not by faith alone, but by dread. The Inquisition has become both the guardian and the executioner of humanity's soul. And as the time of ending deepens, as the galaxy fractures beneath storms unceasing, the question grows louder though no one dares to voice it. Can mankind endure when its saviours are also its destroyers? Can an Imperium bound by fear truly outlast the endless night? No conclave, no council, no seal offers the answer. Only silence, only suspicion, only fire. The consequences of inquisitorial omnipotence echo far beyond the chambers of power or the ruins of purged worlds. They reverberate in the quiet spaces of the Imperium, in the hushed voices of citizens who dare not speak too loudly, in the wary glances of soldiers who wonder whether their loyalty will one day be judged insufficient. The Inquisition has shaped not only the survival of humanity, but the very soul of mankind itself, bending it toward fear, suspicion, and silence. It is here, in the intangible realm of belief and memory, that its greatest legacy lies. For what does it mean to preserve humanity if humanity itself is remade in the image of its protectors? Inquisitors teach vigilance, but vigilance without trust. They embody faith, but faith enforced by terror. They demand purity, yet their own hands are forever stained by compromise. And still they endure, because the Imperium endures, or perhaps the reverse is truer, that the Imperium endures only because they do. Their existence raises a question that can never be answered, only endured. Is mankind's survival worth the price of its soul? And if so, who among them dares to pay it? The irony is as sharp as a blade. Inquisitors are men and women, fragile flesh bound to mortal lives, yet they carry the weight of gods. They speak with authority beyond kings, yet they are haunted by doubts no common citizen could bear. Many fall, some are consumed by the very powers they sought to resist, and others simply vanish into obscurity, their deeds unrecorded, their names unspoken. But the Inquisition itself remains, eternal not in form but in necessity. For so long as the Imperium survives on the knife edge of extinction, so too will Inquisitors rise to guard it, or to break it. To the outsider, this paradox may appear intolerable, yet to the Imperium it has become truth, woven into its marrow as deeply as worship of the Emperor himself. Humanity has grown accustomed to its own damnation, walking hand in hand with the very forces that erode it, because to abandon the Inquisition would be to embrace annihilation. And so the cycle continues. Suspicion breeds purges, purges breed scars, scars breed new suspicions. The wheel turns endlessly, grinding down worlds, peoples, and faith, yet always in the name of preservation. Perhaps the Emperor foresaw this, when he entrusted Malcador with the seed of the Inquisition. Perhaps he knew that salvation could never come from love or unity, but only from the cold discipline of fear. Or perhaps it was simply necessity, born in a moment of desperation, a compromise that metastasized into an eternal law. Whatever its origin, the Inquisition has become more than an institution. It is a philosophy, a shadow cast across eternity, And so the Imperium lives on, ruthless, fearless, omnipotent only in its capacity to destroy itself to endure. The Inquisition stands at its heart, the silent hand that preserves by burning, that judges by erasing, that saves by damning. In the endless night of the 41st millennium, no clearer truth remains. They are humanity's last hope, and its final damnation.